When several months ago I accepted the kind invitation to be the guest of honour and to give this address today, I had no idea that I would not be in Hong Kong, and I truly regret that I am not. However, the reason that I'm not has got several really important messages for public health. After I accepted the invitation for this graduation, I was invited to a whole-day consultation at the Central Party School for the Communist Party of China's Central Committee in Beijing to discuss tobacco policy in China. The CCPS, as it's called, as you may know, is a school for the top, for the elite echelons of the party in China, and the think tank for forward planning for the whole country. It has been headed by Xi Jinping, who may now hand over this to the current Vice President. And this, in fact, is the first opportunity that those working in tobacco control in China have had access and discussion with the very top leadership. So what are the principles for public health? Firstly, to seize the moment, no matter how unexpected, to promote public health. And there is an imperative for me to be in Beijing today because the tobacco epidemic in China is actually overwhelming. 1 in every 3 cigarettes smoked in the world is smoked in China. Close to 3,000 people die every single day from smoking, the highest number of deaths for any country. So China is indeed an imperative. The next lesson is to work from the top down as well as from the bottom up in any political system, whether it's a centrally planned economy, whether it's a kingdom, or whether it's a freewheeling democracy. In my experience of working on tobacco control and other non-communicable diseases in Asia for 30 years, the epidemic, the obstacles, the interventions are surprisingly similar between diverse political systems of government. And this slide shows that you also need to learn when to work behind the scenes and when to go public. I was consulted by the CCPS about 2 years ago, and I told no one. And this was for several reasons. It's always important to be trusted by policymakers. It's important that they, and not you, announce the measure. And also, in the case of tobacco, it's really important that the tobacco industry does not have advance warning of a policy shift, or they would do their utmost to sabotage it. And then as well to stay behind the scenes and then when to go public. And this is a lovely picture of refacing billboards in Australia some years ago. The other thing that you need to master, and it will be very much part of the conference in China, is health economics. Because one of the biggest obstacles to tobacco control is the misperception, fueled, I might say, by the tobacco industry, that any public health measure to reduce tobacco will harm the economy, it will put farmers out of work and other workers out of jobs, or restaurants will close. And none of these is true. And health economists agree, the World Bank, the World Economic Forum and so on, that the cost of prevention today on all the non-communicable diseases will far outweigh the future costs of inaction now. It's very important to make sure, therefore, that the finance branch of government understands that tobacco affects the wealth as well as the health of nations. There are substantial direct and indirect costs of tobacco to governments, to employers, to smokers and to their families, medical and healthcare costs, higher sickness and absence rates, premature death and increased early retirement due to ill health, even time off work for smoke breaks, reduced productivity and the additional costs of second-hand smoke. There are costs from fires caused by careless smoking. About 1/3 of all the fires in the world are caused by smoking, damage to buildings, and the daily litter of billions of discarded cigarettes, matches, packets, lighters. The cost of deforestation as trees are cut down to cure tobacco, and the cost of the use of arable land that could grow food, and in the case of many countries, including China, the loss of foreign exchange if cigarettes are imported. The other thing we now need to learn is to learn a new public health language. It's become very clear to me only recently that framing tobacco as a health or an economic issue is not enough. If non-communicable diseases are to be supported by the World Bank, by the United Nations Development Project, by the next round of the Millennium Development Goals, by the Asian Development Bank, and then funded by national or bilateral aid agreements, then to resonate with the donors, it needs to be framed under a development agenda, especially in the low and middle income countries. And we have to learn about things like development agendas and poverty and frame our non-communicable diseases under those. China, by the way, is one of only 4 countries to have tobacco both in its National Development Plan and also its United Nations Development Assistance Framework, one of only 4 in the world. The next thing we have to do, of course, is to monitor the vector, in this case the tobacco industry. How the industry secretly hired consultants, including here in Hong Kong, how they sponsored symposia, financed research, issued spurious claims that tobacco control would harm the economy, engaged in lobbying, funded ineffective youth smoking prevention campaigns, smokers' rights organisations, as you see here, such as the Lion Rock Institute and Momentum 107, engaged in a range of promotional strategies, opposed all effective tobacco control measures with the government here. And recently they have taken to challenging governments with transnational litigation and trade-based threats through bilateral investment treaties and even through the World Trade Organization. The leopard, in fact, has not changed its spots, it's just changed its tactics. Many other industries, for a range of NCDs, risk factors, alcohol, sugar, fast foods, colas and the salt industry, seem to be behaving very similarly. The next thing we have to do is to translate the research into policy. And this is a major challenge, as governments do not instinctively reach for data when designing government policy. And few policymakers have the scientific background to interpret the validity of evidence. They are not science trained. Governments also believe that scientific evidence is but one aspect of designing policy. They consider they have to listen to all opinion, including the tobacco industry and public opinion, which in fact may be grievously uninformed. Some governments only look for popularity for the next election, rather than making sound long-term decisions, so it is not easy to translate research into policy. The other thing to know is what works and what does not work. And we have a famous scream test that applies to the tobacco industry, and I suspect to many of the other industries that I've just mentioned. If the industry screams, the measure will be effective. If the industry ignores a measure and remains silent, it almost certainly will not have any effect in reducing smoking rates. Thus, the industry screams at raising tobacco taxes, at creating smoke-free areas and bans on promotion, and latterly on Australia's plain packaging. They take little notice of traditional health education in schools, little notice on ban on sales to minors and weak health warnings. So in one sense, our research is done for us. And they always seek voluntary agreements rather than legislation, and we know, and history has shown, that voluntary agreements simply do not work. It comes as a surprise to very many people to realise it's a fiscal measure that has the greatest impact on smoking rates. Put simply, raising the tobacco price of cigarettes beyond the range of children. And evidence is emerging that this is also true for alcohol. We also have learned from the tobacco epidemic that the traditional medical model is not enough. We've learnt this over the last 50 years. That any reduction in tobacco use will not be achieved in the corridors of hospitals or clinics, but in the corridors of power, involving governments, politics, legislation, litigation, taxation, trade, the media, tackling big business, crime, and indeed corruption, and forming hitherto unusual partnerships, such as with customs officials, lawyers, women's human rights, and environmental groups. You may need to go to court to testify in a smuggling case, something few of us doctors were ever trained to do. Or in fact to collate economic arguments and craft a submission to a Minister of Finance to increase tobacco taxes, not a skill taught in medical schools. Even writing a press release on your research and holding a press conference, which is imperative if your work is to reach millions, tends to be a skill learnt on the job. You certainly need to understand to use proven effective strategies, and these in fact are already well known. It only requires political will to implement these strategies. The 2005 WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control is the first WHO treaty attempting to use international public health law in order to reduce an epidemic such as tobacco. The first protocol of this particular framework convention was adopted in November 2012. And following up from that, there has also been high-level meetings on non-communicable diseases in the United Nations. In other words, tobacco has come of age. It's moved from being an ad hoc, almost individual campaign to being mainstream public health. And in addition, World Health Organization has global strategies on healthy diets, on physical activity, and on alcohol. It's important to remember that there are many things that only governments can do at national level. For example, only governments can mandate health legislation. Only governments can introduce a health tax policy. Only governments can ratify the UN conventions or, for example, air regular mass media campaigns. As far as targets goes, only in 2012 really are there now targets for the non-communicable diseases. Some countries have suggested an endgame of 5%, a 5% prevalent smoking rate, and New Zealand has announced that they will achieve this target by 2025. But in Hong Kong, we actually want to beat them to it. And we have set ourselves a target of 2022, in fact the 22nd of the 2nd, 2022, and to hold a press conference at 2 p.m. in the afternoon. This, in fact, would be a marvellous world first for our new administration, and it would have a major effect on our neighbouring Asian countries to reach a 5% target level by that time. It's also very important, if you're working in public health, to understand the obstacles, and they are surprisingly similar around the world. Top of that list must come the tobacco industry. But also globally, there is a much more massive focus on curative medicine rather than on prevention. Some people see smoking as a personal behaviour. There's also a great deal lack of awareness of the degree of risk, because smoking kills 1 in 2 smokers. And as you will see from this slide, which was taken in Hong Kong at the height of the SARS epidemic, the people in this slide are concerned about catching SARS, but actually there are 3 other risk factors on this slide that will probably kill them long before SARS will. One of them is tobacco, one of them is alcohol, and one of them is obesity. But it's a lack of the relative risk understanding that makes people think that SARS is much more dangerous than tobacco. There's also misunderstandings about tax and economic costs. There's lack of funds for doing research on preventable diseases and risk factors. Some governments find it quite difficult to work with NGOs. I'm glad to say that doesn't apply in Hong Kong. The media may be uninformed or think they have to offer equal time to, for example, the tobacco industry, and up to now no targets have been set. So has advocacy failed? Why has it taken us so long? This tobacco epidemic has persisted in spite of centuries of knowledge and decades of action. Policy, progress, development, public awareness, multiple World Health Assembly resolutions, no less than 15 world conferences since 1967, many regional, national, subnational meetings, regional action plans, the Framework Convention, which came into effect in 2005, and the United Nations Summit. But this perhaps should not surprise us, as historically it has taken at least a century from identification to eradication of other pandemics, for example smallpox and polio, while others like TB and malaria are still far from eradicated. The tobacco industry is expanding, and it's likely to do so for some years to come, because even if prevalence rates are reduced, simply the world population expansion, we will have 2 billion more people in the world by about 2040. That population expansion will override and overcome any decrease in prevalence. So we needn't feel too sorry for the tobacco industries. And what does this mean to you? Your first challenge as graduates of public health is to quantify, to go with the numbers. And always remember that at an individual level, tobacco kills 1 in every 2 users. You have 2 friends shown in this slide. One will attend the other one's funeral. And we have nothing on the market in Hong Kong, no other consumer product that has remotely that degree of risk. And in population level, even for example a 1% reduction of smoking in China, which is why I am there today, but even a 1% reduction of smoking in China will have a much bigger public health effect than a 50% reduction, for example, say in Australia. So if you work in non-communicable diseases, then you need to develop skills around this new policy-centric paradigm. Some of these are quite ancient. In fact, if you look at Sun Tzu's Art of War, he was already saying measure the distances, estimate the expenses, evaluate the forces, assess the possibilities, and plan for victory. And that's a very good template for the work that we need to do today. So thank you again for inviting me here today. And congratulations to those of you who are graduating today. And I wish you all well for an extraordinarily interesting and challenging future as we all move forward in the 21st century.